30 years ago, a teacher tore into a scrawny kid, telling him he'd never amount to anything, threatening to kick him out of school. That kid grew up to be a multimillionaire, and now he's standing at a crossroads, settle an old score or turn a painful memory into something extraordinary. This is the true story of James Carter, and you won't believe what he does next. It's 1995 in Willow Creek, Ohio, a small town where the main street still has a hardware store, a diner, and a barbershop with a spinning pole. The middle school sits at the edge of town, a red brick building with chipped paint and a playground where kids kick up dust at recess. 13-year-old James Carter was one of those kids, skinny, with messy brown hair and a chipped front tooth from a skateboarding wipeout he'd never lived down. His report cards were a disaster, littered with C's and D's, and his backpack was a chaotic mess of crumpled worksheets and half-eaten snacks. But James had something special, a stubborn spark deep inside, a quiet fire that refused to go out no matter how many times life tried to douse it. That spark didn't exactly light up Mrs. Evelyn Harper's 8th grade English class. Mrs. Harper was a force to be reckoned with, a woman in her late 40s with a tight gray bun and glasses that seemed to glare at you before you even spoke. She didn't just teach English, she ran her classroom like a drill sergeant, demanding perfection. A misspelled word was a personal offense, a late assignment, a betrayal. To her, James Carter wasn't a kid with potential. He was a walking headache, always doodling in his notebook instead of analyzing To Kill a Mockingbird. "James Carter," she'd bark, her voice slicing through the stuffy classroom like a whip. "If you spent half as much time on your essays as you do scribbling in that notebook, you might actually pass this class." The other kids would snicker, and James would sink lower in his chair, his face hot with embarrassment. Those scribbles weren't just doodles, though. His notebook was filled with sketches of inventions, wild ideas, like a backpack that could charge a phone or a flashlight powered by body heat. He'd lose himself for hours dreaming up these gadgets, but to Mrs. Harper, they were proof he was slacking off. One rainy October afternoon, things came to a head. James hadn't finished his book report on To Kill a Mockingbird. Truth be told, he'd barely cracked the book. The words felt like they were swimming on the page, and his mind kept wandering to a new idea for a solar-powered skateboard. When Mrs. Harper called him to the front to present, the classroom went dead silent. 30 pairs of eyes bored into him as he stood there, empty-handed, his stomach churning. "Well," Mrs. Harper said, tapping her foot, "don't tell me you've got nothing again, James." He mumbled something about not having time, but she cut him off. Her voice rose, sharp and merciless. "You are the laziest, most irresponsible student I've ever taught," she shouted. "You think you can just coast through life like this? You'll be lucky to graduate high school, let alone make something of yourself. I should expel you right now and save this school the trouble." The class erupted in gasps and giggles. James stood frozen, his fists clenched, fighting back tears. He wanted to yell back, to tell her she was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stared at the scuffed linoleum floor, her words cutting into him like a knife. That moment became a scar, one he'd carry for decades. Not because he believed her, but because he swore he'd prove her wrong. Fast forward a bit, but not too far. James barely made it through middle school, scraping by with just enough passing grades. High school wasn't much better, C's and D's, teachers rolling their eyes, and that notebook still filling up with sketches. His parents, hard-working folks who ran a small grocery store, didn't know what to do with him. They couldn't afford college or fancy tutors, but they loved his passion, even if they didn't get it. After high school, college wasn't in the cards. Money was tight, and James wasn't sure he could handle more classrooms anyway. Instead, he landed a job at Marty's auto shop, fixing cars and tinkering with engines, under the watchful eye of Marty, a gruff mechanic who saw something in the kid. The shop was where James's spark started to glow. He had a knack for solving problem scars that wouldn't start, tools that broke. If something didn't work, he'd rig up a solution from scrap parts. Marty noticed. "Kid," he said one day, wiping grease off his hands, "you've got a brain for this. Don't waste it." Those words hit James hard. so different from Mrs. Harper's venom. For the first time, someone saw his potential and didn't dismiss it. By his early 20s, James was itching for more. The auto shop was fine, but his dreams were bigger than Willow Creek. He'd saved a few $1,000 and turned his parents' garage into a workshop. Those notebook sketches started coming to life. His first invention was a clunky device that charged a phone using kinetic energy from walking. It was ugly, broke half the time, but it worked. He called it the Step Spark and sold a few dozen to friends and coworkers. That small success lit a fire under him, like a match to dry wood. James threw himself into his work, teaching himself engineering from library books and early internet forums. He learned to code badly at first, but enough to make his prototypes smarter. By 25, he'd quit the shop and was living off ramen and grit, building better versions of the Step Spark. A startup in Cleveland took a chance on it, buying his patent for $50,000, a fortune to James at the time. Instead of blowing the money, he poured it into his next idea: modular solar panels for city apartments. That was the game changer. By 30, he'd founded Carter Tech, a company focused on affordable, user-friendly, renewable energy. His panels were a hit with urban renters who wanted to go green without breaking the bank. Investors started calling, contracts rolled in, and by 35, Carter Tech was valued at $200 million. James, the kid who couldn't write a book report, was a multimillionaire. The media ate it up. Forbes called him the garage genius. He landed on their 40 under 40 list, gave TED Talks, and had a community college name a tech lab after him. But no amount of money or accolades silenced Mrs. Harper's voice in his head. Lazy, irresponsible, failure. Every milestone was a quiet middle finger to her, but it didn't heal the scar. He wondered about her. Where was she now? Still teaching? Still tearing into kids? Did she even remember the boy she'd threatened to expel? In June 2025, James was back in Willow Creek, officially to visit his aging parents, who were still running their store. Slower now, but just as stubborn. Unofficially, he was chasing a ghost. Sitting in a local diner, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone, he overheard two women at the next table talking about Willow Creek Middle School. One mentioned Mrs. Harper. "She's retiring this year," the woman said. "Still tough as ever, but the kids respect her in their own way." James's heart skipped. Mrs. Harper was still there, still shaping kids like she'd shaped him for better or worse. He leaned over. "Sorry, did you say Mrs. Harper, the English teacher?" The women nodded, a bit surprised. "Yeah, she's been at it forever." "Why?" "I was her student," James said, keeping it vague. "Just curious." Back at his hotel, he dug deeper. A quick search on X painted a grim picture of the school: leaky roofs, outdated textbooks, no funding for art or tech programs. Another post mentioned Mrs. Harper's retirement ceremony at the end of the school year. James's spark flared. He didn't want to confront her. Not exactly. He wanted to do something bigger, something that would turn his pain into purpose. But what? He started small, calling the school principal Dr. Ellen Nguyen, a no-nonsense woman who'd taken over a decade ago. Posing as an alumnus wanting to give back, he offered to fund a new technology lab. Dr. Nguyen was skeptical. Plenty of people made big promises, but when James outlined a $1 million donation, her tone shifted. "That's incredibly generous, Mr. Carter," she said. "What's the catch?" "No catch," James replied. "But I'd like to present it at Mrs. Harper's retirement ceremony. She was my teacher." Dr. Nguyen agreed, and James got to work. He didn't just want a computer lab. He wanted a game changer. He enlisted Carter Tech's engineers to design a state-of-the-art setup: 20 high-end computers, coding software, 3D printers, and a solar-powered charging station based on his own designs. He also set up a STEM scholarship fund named after his parents, who'd always believed in his crazy ideas. The price tag climbed, but James didn't blink. This was personal. As the ceremony approached, James felt a mix of nerves and resolve. He hadn't seen Mrs. Harper in 32 years. Would she recognize him? Would she care? He kept picturing her stern face, those glasses glaring at him over a stack of unmarked essays, But he wasn't that scared kid anymore. He was a man with a mission, not to prove her wrong, but to thank her in a way she'd never expect. The end-of-year assembly was held in the school's gymnasium, packed with students, parents, and teachers under a ceiling of faded championship banners. James sat in the back, dressed in a simple button-down and jeans, trying to blend in. The air was thick with the buzz of kids ready for summer. On stage, a banner read, "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," in bold blue letters, surrounded by balloons. There she was, sitting in a folding chair, older but unmistakable white hair still in that tight bun, eyes sharp as ever behind new glasses. She held a plaque, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Dr. Nguyen opened the event, praising Mrs. Harper's 40 years of teaching. "She's shaped generations," she said, pushing students to be their best, even when they didn't want to hear it. James stifled a smirk. That was one way to put it. He scanned the crowd, parents fanning themselves with programs, kids whispering, a few older alumni like him. Did any of them carry the same scars from Mrs. Harper's class? When it was time for his part, Dr. Nguyen introduced a generous alumnus with a surprise for the school. James stood, his heart pounding, and walked to the stage. The crowd murmured. Nobody knew who he was. He took the microphone, his palms sweaty, and faced the sea of faces. Mrs. Harper's eyes met his, narrowing slightly, like she was trying to place him. "Good afternoon," James began, his voice steadying. "I'm James Carter, class of '95. I was in Mrs. Harper's English class, probably driving her up the wall with my half-finished homework and doodles." The crowd chuckled, easing the tension. "I wasn't a star student. Honestly, I barely made it out of here. But I'm here because of something Mrs. Harper told me. She said I'd never get anywhere unless I got my act together." Tough words, but they stuck. They pushed me to prove I could be more. He glanced at Mrs. Harper. Her face was unreadable, but her hands gripped the plaque tighter. "Today, I'm proud to announce that Carter Tech, my company, is donating a new technology lab to Willow Creek Middle School. Top of the line computers, robotics kits, 3D printers, and a scholarship fund to help kids chase their dreams, just like I did." The gym exploded in cheers. Kids jumped up, parents clapped, and teachers whispered in shock. Dr. Nguyen beamed, but James kept his focus on Mrs. Harper. She was staring at him, her lips parted, like she was seeing a ghost. "This isn't just about giving back," James said. "It's about saying thank you. Mrs. Harper, you were toadier than I thought I could handle. But your words, even the ones that hurt, made me who I am. I built Carter Tech because I wanted to prove I wasn't a failure. And now I want this school to give every kid a chance to prove themselves, too, so thank you." He stepped back, handing the mic to Dr. Nguyen, who launched into details about the lab. The crowd was still buzzing, but James's eyes were on Mrs. Harper. She stood slowly, her movements stiff, and made her way to him as the assembly wrapped up. Up close, he saw the lines etched into her face, the weight of years spent in classrooms. Her eyes, though, were as sharp as ever. "James Carter," she said, her voice low but firm. "I remember you, the boy with the wild ideas and no discipline." She studied him, like she was grading one of his old essays. "I didn't think you'd make it this far." James laughed, a little bitterly. "You made that clear back then. But you were right to push me. I needed it." Her lips twitched, almost a smile. "I was hard on you. Harder than I should have been, maybe. But you were infuriating, always sketching instead of writing. I thought you were wasting your potential." "You weren't wrong," James admitted. "I was a mess. But those sketches, they became Carter Tech. And your words, even the yelling, kept me going." Mrs. Harper's eyes softened, just a fraction. "I don't know what to say. This lab, it's more than I ever expected." "You don't have to say anything," James said. "Just know it's because of you, not in spite of you." They stood there, an awkward silence between them, two people connected by a painful past and an unexpected present. Before she could respond, a group of kids swarmed James, asking about the robotics kits. Mrs. Harper stepped back, watching him with a look he couldn't quite read, pride maybe, or something close to it. The gymnasium at Willow Creek Middle School was still buzzing as the end-of-year assembly wrapped up in June 2025. Kids swarmed James Carter, peppering him with questions about the robotics kits in the new tech lab he'd just donated. Parents shook his hand, teachers whispered in awe, and the air crackled with excitement. But James's eyes kept drifting to Mrs. Evelyn Harper, the woman who'd once torn him down in front of a classroom. She stood off to the side now, her white bun as tight as ever, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite pin down: pride, maybe, or regret. Their brief exchange after his speech had left him rattled. She remembered him, not just as a troublemaker, but as a kid with potential she hadn't known how to reach. That admission stirred something in James, a mix of closure and curiosity. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew this wasn't the end. The $1 million donation, state-of-the-art tech lab with computers, 3D printers, and a STEM scholarship fund was already the talk of Willow Creek. Local news vans were parked outside, and posts on X were blowing up with headlines like "Millionaire alum shocks school with massive gift," and "From flunking to funding." A success story. James hadn't expected the attention, but he wasn't surprised. $1 million in a small town like this was like dropping a meteor. What he didn't expect was how it would shift his own perspective. Standing in that gym, surrounded by kids who reminded him of his younger self, he realized his spark the one Mrs. Harper had unknowingly fanned wasn't just about proving her wrong anymore. It was about lighting the way for others. Over the next few days, James stuck around Willow Creek, working with Principal Dr. Ellen Nguyen to hammer out details for the tech lab. They toured the school, walking through classrooms with flickering fluorescent lights and textbooks so old they mentioned Pluto as a planet. The computer room was a relic. Half the machines were from the early 2000s, wheezing like they were on life support. Dr. Nguyen didn't sugarcoat it. "We've been scraping by for years," she said, kicking a loose floor tile. "Budget cuts hit us hard. Teachers buy supplies out of pocket, and the kids, they deserve better." James nodded, his jaw tight. He saw himself in those kids' dreamers, stuck in a system that didn't know how to nurture them. The tech lab was a start, but it felt like a Band-Aid on a broken leg. He met with teachers who shared stories of students who shone despite the odds. A girl who coded apps on her phone, a boy who built a wind turbine from scrap metal. They reminded him of his own doodles, those notebook sketches that became Carter Tech. He started to see Willow Creek Middle School not just as a painful memory, but as a place where sparks like his could catch fire if someone gave them a chance. That's when the idea hit him. Why stop at one lab? Why not transform the whole school? He pulled Dr. Nguyen aside during a planning meeting. "What if we went bigger?" he asked. "Not just tech, but science labs, art rooms, a library with actual books. What would it take to make this place a launch pad for kids?" Dr. Nguyen blinked, like she wasn't sure she'd heard him right. "James, that's a dream, but we're talking millions. The district can't afford it, and grants are a long shot." "I'm not talking about the district," James said, leaning forward. "I'm talking about me, Carter Tech. What's the number?" She hesitated, then grabbed a notepad and started crunching figures: new facilities, updated equipment, teacher training, scholarships. The total came to $5 million. James didn't flinch. "Let's do it," he said. "But I want it done right. And I want it dedicated at Mrs. Harper's retirement party next week." Dr. Nguyen stared at him, her pen frozen. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," James replied. "Mrs. Harper pushed me to be better, even if it hurt. This is my way of saying her tough love mattered, Ed, not just for me, but for every kid who comes through here." She shook her head, a slow smile spreading. "You're something else, James Carter." The plan took shape fast. James called his team at Carter Tech, looping in engineers, architects, and his CFO, Priya Sharma, who nearly choked when he outlined the $5 million commitment. "James, this is huge," she said over a video call, her voice sharp. "The board's already twitchy about the $1 million lab. They're calling it a vanity project. You sure you want to double down?" "It's not vanity," James shot back. "It's strategy. Education's the next frontier for Carter Tech. We're not just making solar panels, we're building systems for the future. These kids are the future. Priya sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. I get the vision, but the board sees a CEO chasing ghosts. They're worried you're letting personal stuff cloud your judgment. James bristled. Personal stuff? Priya, I'm closing a chapter, not writing a memoir. This is about impact. Fine, she said, softening. But tread carefully. The board loves your results, not your feelings. Keep them focused on the numbers. Her words stung, echoing Mrs. Harper's old warnings about discipline. James pushed the doubt aside, but it lingered. Was he letting the past drive him? He didn't think so, but the line between purpose and obsession was blurry. Back in Willow Creek, James threw himself into the project. He met with contractors to plan renovations, worked with teachers to design a curriculum around the new tech, and even sat in on a science class, where a kid showed him a homemade circuit board. The boy's eyes lit up when James explained how his step spark worked, and for a moment, James felt like he was 13 again, sketching in his notebook. That's when he knew he was on the right path. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harper's retirement party was shaping up to be the event of the year. The school was hosting it in the gym, with string lights, a catered buffet, and a slideshow of her 40-year career. James decided to make it the stage for his bigger announcement. He didn't just want to give her a plaque or a handshake, he wanted to honor her in a way that would echo through Willow Creek for generations. He worked with Dr. Nguyen to dedicate the entire renovation project to her, naming it the Evelyn Harper Learning Center. He also set up a teacher training fund to help educators use the new tech, ensuring her legacy would live on in every kid who walked those halls. But first, he wanted to talk to Mrs. Harper again, one-on-one. He found her a few days before the party, packing up her classroom. The room hadn't changed, much same chalkboard, same creaky desks, but it felt smaller, less intimidating. Mrs. Harper was sorting through a box of old papers, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Mr. Carter, she said, looking up. Didn't expect you back so soon. Call me James, he said, leaning against a desk. I wanted to talk before the party, about the lab, the school, and us. She raised an eyebrow. Us? Yeah, he said, scratching the back of his neck. I've been carrying your words for 30 years. Not just the tough ones, but the idea that I could be better. I didn't see it then, but you were part of why I kept pushing. Mrs. Harper set down a stack of papers, her eyes softening. I was too hard on a lot of kids, you especially. I thought if I scared you straight, you'd stop wasting time on those drawings. I didn't see what you were building. James nodded. I didn't either, not then. But your words, even the yelling, lit a fire. I wouldn't be here without it. She looked away, her voice quieter. I've taught thousands of kids, most fade from memory. But you, James, I remembered you, not just because you were a handful, because you had something special. I just didn't know how to reach it. Her words hit him like a punch. All these years, he'd thought she saw him as a lost cause. But she'd seen his spark, even if she didn't know what to do with it. You reached it, he said. In your own way. They talked for nearly an hour, swapping stories about the old days and the kids she'd taught since. James shared how his doodles became Carter Tech, how he'd built solar panels from those early sketches. She told him about students who'd surprised her, the ones who'd come back to thank her, and the ones she wished she'd taught differently. It wasn't a tearjerker moment, but it was real, and it stitched up a wound James hadn't realized was still bleeding. The retirement party was a warm June evening. The gym transformed with twinkling lights and tables piled with food. Mrs. Harper, dressed in a simple navy dress, greeted colleagues and former students, her usual sternness softened by the occasion. James stood in the back, watching her. She looked different, lighter, like she was finally letting go of the weight of 40 years. When it was time for his speech, Dr. Nguyen introduced him again, this time as the alumnus who's changing Willow Creek forever. James took the stage, the crowd quieting. Mrs. Harper's eyes locked onto his, curious but guarded. Good evening, James started, his voice steady. I stood here a week ago, thanking Mrs. Harper for pushing me to be more. Tonight, I'm here to do it again, but bigger. Carter Tech isn't just giving a tech lab. We're funding a full renovation of Willow Creek Middle School new science labs, art rooms, a library, and more. $5 million to make this place a launch pad for every kid's dreams. The crowd gasped, then erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, and X-posts started flying. James held up a hand, signaling he wasn't done. We're calling it the Evelyn Harper Learning Center, because Mrs. Harper didn't just teach English. She taught us to demand more from ourselves. Her lessons, though, as they were, sparked futures she might not have seen coming, like mine. He looked at Mrs. Harper, who was standing now, her hands trembling. We're also starting a teacher training fund in her name, so educators can keep inspiring kids the way she did. Mrs. Harper, this is for you and for every kid who needs a push to find their spark. The gym roared with cheers. Mrs. Harper didn't speak. She wasn't one for big displays, but she met James's eyes and nodded, a silent thank you that carried more weight than words. Later, as the party wound down, she pulled him aside. You didn't have to do this, she said, her voice thick. The lab was enough. It's too much. It's not enough, James replied. You changed my life. I'm just passing it on. The announcement sent ripples far beyond Willow Creek. National news picked up the story, with headlines like, Millionaire honors harsh teacher with 5M school gift. X was flooded with reaction. Some called it the ultimate redemption. Others speculated James was flexing his wealth. His team at Carter Tech got calls from other schools, nonprofits, even state officials, all wanting a piece of the action. James realized his spark was igniting a movement. But not everyone was on board. At a Carter Tech board meeting in Chicago, Priya Sharma cornered him. James, the school project's great PR, but $5 million? The board's freaking out. They're saying you're turning Carter Tech into a charity. It's not charity, James said, his voice firm. It's investment. These kids will be our engineers, our innovators. This is Carter Tech's future. Priya crossed her arms. And Mrs. Harper? You're telling me this isn't about proving a point? It's about closing a loop, James said, and opening new ones. For the school, for the kids, for me. She sighed but nodded. Just watch your step. The board's behind you for now. Don't give them a reason to doubt. Her warning stuck with him, stirring the same unease he'd felt as a kid under Mrs. Harper's glare. Was he pushing too hard, too fast? He didn't think so. But doubt was a sneaky thing. Back in Willow Creek, James kept working, meeting with architects and teachers to refine the renovation plans. He also started mentoring a few students, showing them how to use the new tech. One girl, Mia, reminded him of himself, quiet, always sketching, bursting with ideas. When he showed her how to program a 3D printer, her face lit up, and James felt a pang of pride. This was why he was doing it, not just for Mrs. Harper, but for kids like Mia, like he'd been. As Mrs. Harper's retirement sank in, James wondered what she'd do next. He'd heard she lived alone, her husband gone years ago, no kids of her own. Teaching had been her life, and now that was ending. He felt a strange urge to check on her, to make sure she knew her work hadn't been forgotten. But he also knew the school project was just the start. Willow Creek was one town, one school. There were thousands more like it, and James's spark was burning brighter than ever. What could he do with it? The summer of 2025 in Willow Creek, Ohio, was one nobody would forget. The small town was buzzing with talk of James Carter's $5 million pledge to transform Willow Creek Middle School into the Evelyn Harper Learning Center. Construction crews were already on site, tearing out old linoleum and hauling in shiny new equipment. Kids peeked through the chain-link fence, whispering about 3D printers and robotics labs, while parents swapped stories at the diner about the local boy who made good. Posts on X kept the story alive, with hashtags like Willow Creek Miracle trending locally. James was everywhere on the news, in group chats, even on a billboard by the highway that read, "Thank you, James Carter," courtesy of the town council. But for James, the spotlight felt like a double-edged sword. The more people cheered, the more he felt the weight of what he'd started and the pressure to see it through. Back at Carter Tech's headquarters in Chicago, the boardroom was less celebratory. James's $5 million commitment had stirred up a storm among the executives. His CFO, Priya Sharma, had warned him the board was uneasy, and now they were pushing back hard. At a tense meeting in late June, the chairman, Richard Hayes, didn't mince words. "James, we love your passion," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "But this school project is looking like a personal crusade. $5 million? That's shareholder money, not your piggy bank." James stood at the head of the table, his jaw tight. "It's not a crusade," he said. "It's an investment. Those kids in Willow Creek will be our next engineers, coders, innovators. Carter Tech's future depends on talent, and talent starts in places like that school." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "That's a nice story, but investors want numbers, not nostalgia. Your stock's taken a hit since the announcement, 3% down. They're spooked. You're betting big on a small town, and we need to know it's not about settling some old score." The room went quiet. James felt every eye on him, Priya's included. He knew the board saw him as a visionary, but visionaries who burned cash on feel-good projects didn't last long. "This isn't about the past," he said, his voice steady. "It's about the future. Give me 6 months. You'll see the impact in the school, on our brand, on our bottom line." Hayes didn't look convinced, but he nodded. 6 months, James. Show us results, or we'll have to rethink your priorities." The meeting left James shaken. He'd built Carter Tech from a garage workshop to a $200 million company. But for the first time, he felt his grip slipping. Priya caught him in the hallway afterward. "You okay?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. "Fine," James lied, loosening his tie. "Just need to prove them wrong again." She gave him a long look. "You've been proving people wrong your whole life. Maybe it's time to stop fighting ghosts and start trusting what you've built." Her words stuck with him, echoing Mrs. Harper's long-ago warnings about focus. Was he still running from her voice, proving he wasn't a failure? He pushed the thought aside, but it lingered like a shadow. Back in Willow Creek, the school project was moving at lightning speed. By July, the tech lab was fully installed, and summer programs were underway to train teachers on the new equipment. James made regular trips from Chicago, rolling up his sleeves to help unpack computers or troubleshoot software. He loved seeing the kids' faces light up when they printed their first 3D model or coded a robot to move. One girl, Mia, the quiet sketcher who reminded him of himself, had become his unofficial shadow. She'd show him her design's wild ideas for solar-powered backpacks or water purifier sand. James would nod, remembering his own notebook. "Keep at it, Mia," he'd say. "Those ideas could change the world." But the project wasn't without hiccups. Construction delays pushed back the science lab renovations, and some parents grumbled about fancy gadgets when the school still needed basics like new desks. A few older teachers resisted the tech training, saying they were too close to retirement to learn coding. James listened to every complaint, tweaking plans where he could. He didn't want this to be his project, wanted it to be Willow Creek's. Mrs. Harper, now officially retired, was a quieter presence. James hadn't seen her much since the retirement party, but he heard she'd been spotted at the school, watching the construction from a distance. He wondered what she was thinking. Was she proud? Overwhelmed? He felt a pull to reach out, to make sure she knew this wasn't just a grand gesture. Her words had shaped him, for better or worse, and he wanted her to see the full circle. One humid August afternoon, he drove to her house, a modest bungalow on a quiet street, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a porch swing. He knocked, half expecting her to scold him for showing up unannounced. When she opened the door, she looked different, their hair loose, her glasses perched on her head, a gardening apron smudged with dirt. "James Carter," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "What trouble are you causing now?" "No trouble," he said, grinning. "Just wanted to check in. Mind if I sit?" She led him to the porch, offering iced tea from a pitcher. They sat on the swing, the creak of the chains filling the silence. James took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about you," he said. "About what this all means, the school, the center, everything. I need you to know it's not just about the money. It's because of you. Your voice, even when it hurt, kept me going. Mrs. Harper sipped her tea, her eyes distant. You're giving me too much credit, she said. I was just doing my job badly sometimes. I thought being tough would make kids stronger. With you, I went too far. James shook his head. You didn't. You saw something in me, even if you didn't know what it was. That's why I named the center after you. It's not just a building, it's your legacy. She looked at him, her eyes glistening. Legacy, she murmured. I spent 40 years teaching, thinking I was making a difference. But most days, I wondered if it mattered. Seeing what you're doing, it makes me think maybe it did. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing easier than it ever had. She shared stories of her early years teaching, the kids who'd stayed in touch, the ones she'd lost track of. James opened up about Carter Tech, the pressure from the board, the doubt creeping in. I'm trying to do right by the school, he said, but I'm not sure I'm doing right by my company. Mrs. Harper set her glass down, her old teacher's sharpness returning. You've always had a head full of ideas, James, but ideas aren't enough. You need discipline, focus. You're spreading yourself thin, trying to fix the world. Pick your battles, or you'll lose them all. Her words hit like a flashback to 1995, but this time, they didn't sting. They grounded him. You're still teaching me, he said, chuckling. Somebody's got to, she replied, a rare twinkle in her eye. By September, the Evelyn Harper Learning Center was taking shape. The science labs were nearly done, the library was stocked with thousands of new books, and the art room had easels and pottery wheels that made kids gasp. James organized an open house to show off the progress, inviting the whole town. Hundreds showed up, parents, students, alumni, even reporters from Cleveland. Mia and a few other kids gave demos, showing off robots and 3D printed models. The crowd cheered, and James felt a surge of pride. This was what he'd been chasing, not revenge, not validation, but impact. Mrs. Harper was there too, quieter than most, standing near the tech lab. James caught her eye and walked over. What do you think? He asked. She looked around, her gaze lingering on a group of kids coding. It's more than I ever dreamed for this place, she said. You've done something special, James. We've done something special, he corrected. This is as much yours as mine. She didn't argue, just nodded. Her lips pressed tight, like she was holding back tears. Before she left, she handed him a small envelope. Open it later, she said, and don't make a fuss. Inside, later that night, he found a handwritten letter. It was short, in her precise cursive. James, I was wrong about you, but you proved me right in the end. Thank you for showing me my work mattered. Keep sparking fires. Evelyn Harper. He read it twice, his throat tight, then tucked it into his wallet. It was the closure he hadn't known he needed. At Carter Tech, the tide started to turn. The open house footage went viral, racking up millions of views on X and YouTube. Major outlets like CNN and the New York Times ran features on the millionaire who transformed his hometown school. Carter Tech stock rebounded, climbing 5% as investors saw the PR goldmine. Brands reached out for partnerships, and the company's social impact division, sparked by the Willow Creek project, drew interest from top talent. Priya texted James a single emoji, of fire. He laughed, knowing he'd dodged a bullet. At the next board meeting, James laid out a plan to expand the Willow Creek model to other underserved schools, tying it to Carter Tech's core mission of sustainable innovation. He showed data-rising community engagement, early test score improvements, and a flood of internship applications from high schoolers inspired by the project. This isn't charity, he told the board. It's our edge. We're building the future, one spark at a time. Hayes, the chairman, leaned back, a grudging smile on his face. You've got your 6 months, James. Keep delivering. By December 2025, the Evelyn Harper Learning Center was fully open. Willow Creek Middle School wasn't just a school anymore, it was a beacon. Kids from neighboring towns transferred in, teachers applied from across the state, and the scholarship fund sent its first students to STEM camps. James visited often, mentoring kids like Mia, who'd started a coding club. He also kept in touch with Mrs. Harper, dropping by her bungalow for iced tea and tough love. She'd taken up painting, her porch now lined with canvases of sunsets and flowers. "Not bad for an old teacher," she'd say, and James would laugh, seeing her spark still burning. The project grew beyond Willow Creek. Carter Tech launched the Spark Initiative, a $50 million program to fund tech labs and scholarships in 100 rural schools by 2030. James became a reluctant celebrity, speaking at education conferences and advising policymakers. But he stayed grounded, carrying Mrs. Harper's letter as a reminder of why he started. One quiet evening, sitting on his parents' porch in Willow Creek, James reflected on the journey. He'd come back to face a ghost, but found a purpose. Mrs. Harper's words harsh, then healing had shaped him, and now he was shaping others. The scar from 1995 was still there, but it didn't hurt anymore. It was a mark of survival, of growth, of a spark that never went out.